In a recent interview with ESPN, Joseph Newgarden, the 2023 and 2024 Indy 500 winner, suggested that any of the top guys from IndyCar would be able to go to Formula One and give it a red-hot go, as the Australians would say. And no joking, some of them probably could, Scott McLaughlin especially, but there are still those that think that, well, none of them would. Because in Europe, well, amongst the F1 elitists that is, the thinking is that IndyCar is full of F1 rejects that couldn't hack it at the top level. They also think that IndyCar is too simple, that the skill level is just not on par with what there is in Formula 1, and that the likes of Verstappen, Hamilton and Alonso would go and win instantly. It's further perpetuated when Michael Schumacher himself said that he wouldn't go to IndyCar because it would be a step down, as well as being too dangerous, and that he's got nothing to prove over there. The last time a Formula 1 world champion went over to America and won was 1993 when Nigel Mansell won the kart title, but I'm just going to say IndyCar just to keep things nice and simple. Before that, Emerson Fittipaldi won the title in 1989. And in the US they have their racing royal family, the Andrettis. Well, one of them, because there's also the Unzers, but the Andretti family is part of the myth and legend surrounding the IndyCar series, and also one of the unluckiest because the Andretti curse at Indianapolis is very real. All those members of the family, all those accolades and all that other stuff, but only a single win at the 500. And Mario is only one of 3 people to win a NASCAR race, an F1 race, and an IndyCar race. The other 2? Juan Pablo Montoya and Dan Gurney. Andretti's stats speak for themselves. He's one of only 2 American world champions, sharing that accolade with Phil Hill, who is no relation to Damon and Graham, and he's won in basically anything that you could put him in. He's won a Daytona 500, 4 IndyCar titles, a 12 Hours of Sebring, a Daytona 24, a Pikes Peak Hill Climb, an Indy 500, and the already mentioned Formula 1 World Championship. Oh, and he's got a class win at Le Mans in 1995, which could have been an overall win if they'd hung on just a little bit longer, and that would have landed him a Triple Crown alongside Graham Hill. Mario is also one of 3 Formula 1 drivers to have scored a pole position at the first attempt. He achieved that in 1968. The other 2 were Carlos Reutemann in 1972 and Daniel Ricciardo's best mate in the whole wide world, Jacques Villeneuve, the latter doing that in 1996. And speaking of, the 1996 season review video said that Andretti did it in 78. Ben Edwards got that fact 10 years out somehow. So Mario is the patriarch of the family. There are other members of the Andretti family, but the one we need to concern ourselves with today is Michael Andretti, Mario's son. He too had a Formula 1 career, but it wasn't as successful as his father's, and now he's become the go-to comparison when it comes to drivers coming over from America. Michael Andretti, before having brick wall after brick wall thrown up at him by Formula 1 trying to block his team's entry, was already established as a driver in the US, and not just because he was the son of Mario. He had recently won the 1991 Kart PPG IndyCar World Series, winning 8 of the 17 rounds and also led over 50% of the available laps. Despite this, it was still a battle between him and Bobby Rahal for the series win. I'm guessing it was one of those, yes, he won a lot, but the races he didn't win, he didn't score much at all types of deals. It actually was. Rahal only won 1 race all year and still took the series to the final race. Rahal was way more consistent across the season by the looks of it. Unfortunately, there's no race reports for these events, so it's not clear how many of these bad results were down to driver error or mechanical issues. It's actually mental how that's gone the way that it has. 1992 started a little bit slower, but he still won a few races later on. Rahal, though, would still win the championship. But for 1993, it was going to be pretty much an exchange program. Mansell was coming over from Formula 1 to go to IndyCar and actually ended up taking Andretti's car, if you follow me with that, and then Andretti was going to Formula 1, but not into a Williams, but into a McLaren. Andretti had signed for McLaren in the summer of 1992, with the deal being announced at the Italian Grand Prix of that year, as is traditional with Formula 1 with this sort of thing. Ron Dennis reckoned that in time Andretti would be able to win races and maybe win the World Championship, later saying that it doesn't matter where you're from so long as you have the desire and ability to win. I'm guessing that there had been a little bit of umming and ahhing over a driver coming into Formula 1 from America. Ew, dirty. McLaren was going to be struggling a tiny bit through 1993 anyway. I've looked over the car in full in its own dedicated video, talking about how a lot of people think that this thing was well off the pace and that only Senna's genius could drag it up through the field to win because it didn't have half of the stuff that the Williams did. but it did. It was one of those clarifications, myth-busting videos, whatever you want to call it. Now, before I become persona non grata or public enemy number one in Brazil, the same way that Teo Porcher has done in Argentina, I just need to clarify something here. Senna did work some wonders in that car. He put in some absolutely blinding performances, especially at Donington. But this thing that some people have about it not being as advanced as the Williams, the McLaren that is a little bit misguided. It still had anti-lock brakes, active suspension, automatic gear shifts, traction control. It basically had everything that the Williams did. It was just the engine holding it back. McLaren had lost Honda at the end of 1992. Mugens would be on the grid in the backs of the footworks, which also have received their own dedicated video, and after being shafted by Honda so late in the season, McLaren would have to rely on underpowered Ford customer engines, which were lesser spec than what Benetton would have in their cars because Benetton was getting first dibs on the Ford engines at that time. McLaren was going to end up with something in the region of a 30 horsepower deficit to the Benettons and even more still to the Renaults in the Williams. But because of Senna's driving style, active cars would suit him better than the likes of Prost and Hill. But all of that stuff that was on the McLaren and the Williams of that time was nowhere to be found on any of the cars that Andretti had driven before. This is what an IndyCar of the 1990s looked like. This is based off a 1999 car, but the cars weren't that far apart between 1993 and 1999. Formula One cars, on the other hand, vastly different. These cars had around 800 to 850 horsepower or so in 1994. They were fueled by methanol, weighed about 750 kilos, and had a stick-shift gearbox. And it was turbocharged. They didn't have anywhere near the amount of downforce on tap compared to a Formula One car and would be a little bit more slippery to drive, as well as being a bit more sluggish in the corners on road courses due to not being as downforce dependent. If Andretti had entered Formula One a couple of years before or even a couple of years after 1993, it probably wouldn't have been as bad of a transition, but because he'd gone from something that had nothing to something that had everything, he had to recalibrate the way his brain was working. Like already mentioned, McLaren and Williams had gubbins on the car that would be more at home in your road car than a racing car. Today, anti-lock brakes are only found in things like GT3s and I think they're on TCRs as well, while traction control can be found on prototypes. The thing is, the Formula One cars of 1993 weren't going to be slightly different for Andretti, they were going to be in a totally different world. The FIA had also changed the rules about a bit that didn't help things either. In practice, drivers would now be limited to 23 laps each, and in qualifying there'd only be 12 laps available. They also banned the teams from going to tracks early and then all chipping in to do some testing, which, again, if Andretti had entered a couple of years before, he'd have been able to adapt, especially since pretty much every single track would be brand new to him. In an IndyCar, Andretti would be feeling everything through the steering wheel, his arse, and feeling how the tyres were decaying over the course of a stint, on a road course that is. With these active cars, you committed fully on the turn-in, and on the corner exits, you just put the trust in the computer to do all the work without needing to confirm with your right foot that the grip would be available on the acceleration. If you were Senna or Mansell and you had an aggressive driving style, this would be perfect. The difference in someone not used to the car versus someone who was became evident in the qualifying session for the South African Grand Prix, which was the opening round of the 1993 season. Prost took pole less than a tenth ahead of Senna, while Andretti did end up in the top 10, only a tenth behind the more experienced Marc Blundell in the Ligier, but Andretti was still 3 seconds off his teammate. Now, to be fair, he did only do 4 laps before his engine seized and his teammate was Senna, but even then, 3 seconds off a teammate even in 1993 was an oof moment. The race didn't go much better. He was involved in a collision and that was him done after just 4 laps. At the next round in Brazil, he cut across Gerhard Berger at the start and both of them crashed into the Senna S in a massive accident. Now, it has to be said that at this round, Andretti had done much better. South Africa was by far his worst performance relative to Senna, and at Brazil, Michael was only a second off and was ahead of Patrese in the Benetton, and ahead of the 2 Ferraris at the same time. Also, a lot of Italians on the grid in 1993 as well. Where have they all gone? The next race was at Donington Park. The other McLaren would take all the headlines, as you probably already know, and that is a thing that's had its own dedicated video done too, but despite qualifying 6th, only half a second or so off Senna, Andretti was involved in another first lap accident, this time with Wendlinger. So in the first 3 races of the season, he'd done a total of 4 laps, while his teammate had won 2 Grand Prix. His first proper opportunity for points would come in the 4th round of the season at San Marino, where once again he was racing Wendlinger and was on for 5th and 2 points. But with the pressure building on him, he was going for 4th and overcooked it into the Variante Alta, which is the chicane over the back end of the track on approach to the final 2 corners. He was out again. But at the Spanish Grand Prix, he finally got the duck off his back and he managed to score 2 points by finishing 5th. But the steps that he'd taken forward in Spain were immediately wiped out by the time he got to Monaco. If it could go wrong, it went wrong. The car struggled to get off the line because it was stuck in 3rd, then he hit the Scuderia Italia Barbazza at the Lowe's hairpin, and then had to pit for a new front wing and got stuck in the train unable to overtake. To add insult to injury, Senna, who took his 6th win around Monaco to set a new record, lapped Andretti. Twice. But after this there wouldn't be any collisions, at least for the time being. Any issues he had would be related to the car and the gizmos that were attached to it. In Canada, he had problems with the active suspension in qualifying, then the electrics went at the start of the race, so he had to start 3 laps down. The same active suspension issues in France left him starting down in 14th place, but was able to drive through the field to finish 6th, passing Barrichello's Jordan at the final corner to snag the last point at the death. This being when Manicourt didn't have that start-finish line chicane like it does now. That chicane was before the final 90-degree right-hander. On top of this, there were accusations that Andretti might not be totally committed to Formula 1. Unlike other drivers outside of Europe that have come to the FIA's top level of racing, Andretti stayed in the US and would regularly fly back and forth between America and the UK aboard Concorde, which some think was due to his now ex-wife's insistence, given that his 2 children, Marco and Marissa, were young and uprooting them for potentially a short period of time wouldn't be of benefit. There's also the rumours that this same ex-wife insisted on having her own headset and also be allowed to sit on the pit wall during races, something that usually happens in IndyCar. The wives will have little headsets so they can listen in on what's going on, but it's not really the done thing in Formula 1, especially sitting on the pit wall. This kind of do you not know who I am, I'm with the driver, he's an Andretti type of thing didn't really sit well with the rest of the McLaren crew, and especially with Mr. Bland himself, Ron Dennis. But the whole commuting thing wasn't the full picture. There was other things going on at McLaren at the same time which might have contributed. Senna was essentially on a gap year. He was waiting for that drive at Williams to open up and was going to sign for Frank the second that seat opened up, driving for McLaren on a $1 million per race deal, given that he might not be around for the whole year. On top of this, McLaren had signed Mika Hakkinen, an up-and-coming Finn who would go on to win 2 world titles, and he was waiting in the wings. And because Andretti wasn't around as much as Hakkinen was at the factory, Hakkinen had been able to build up more of a relationship with the guys at Woking. Hakkinen said in an interview with Sky Sports back in 2012 that the mental approach by Andretti wasn't what was required to settle and ultimately succeed in Formula 1. On top of this, the fact that Senna may or may not be around for the whole year, plus Andretti being in his shadow, with the possibility of Hakkinen replacing Andretti, all added up to a very unsettled driver. Meanwhile, Marco Andretti has claimed in a 2008 interview with ESPN that McLaren was intentionally sabotaging Michael's car so they'd have a reason for bringing in Hakkinen early, saying that McLaren wanted him to fail, that McLaren was paying him too much and that Hakkinen was cheaper, as well as giving better cars and engines to Senna, and that it wasn't until the Italian Grand Prix that Senna supposedly stepped in and said, "Give Michael the same car as me." Michael would then go on to not finish at the British, German and Hungarian Grand Prix. At Silverstone he spun off at the first corner on the first lap, while at Hockenheim it was another collision with Berger after having gearbox and active suspension problems. Then in Hungary it was throttle problems, with the rumours of Hakkinen coming in to replace him hotting up. By which point Michael was talking to his old mates back in IndyCar, having chats with Carl Haas and also Chip Ganassi about the possibility of getting a drive back for 1994 or even for the rest of 1993. But then for his final Grand Prix at Monza, everything clicked. Both Andretti and Senna had brake issues over the course of the weekend. Andretti had gone off on the first lap but started to claw his way back up through the field. Senna would collide with Martin Brundle on lap 8 that put them both out of the race, but at the end of it, Andretti had managed to put all the gremlins behind him and showed that he did have what it took to be in Formula 1. Damon Hill in the Williams dominated the race, and it was his 3rd race win in a row, and is also the only driver to take his first 3 wins consecutively in the same season. Hakkinen also did it, but his first 3 wins spanned the last race of the season in 1997 and then the first 2 of 1998. I think it's also the only time that 2 sons of world champions have been on the podium together. Extra facts and stats for you. But despite the heroics at Monza, it was the last race for Andretti in Formula 1. For the next round, Hakkinen would be in the car and Andretti was back off to kart, winning on his return at the Gold Coast. But Andretti would never win the Indy title again, and he would also never win the 500. He now has his own team in the sport and is looking to enter Formula 1. So it does make you wonder then, if Andretti had stuck out the 1993 season and gone into 1994 when all the cars had the technological gizmos removed, he might have done better, as the cars became more of a handful to drive. Might his time have been different if Hakkinen was his teammate and not Senna, or any other driver for that matter? Maybe, as I said earlier, if he'd come in for 1990 or something, it might have been a different story. But the difference between a 1993 IndyCar and a technological marvel that was a 1993 Formula 1 car might have been just too far apart for someone to adapt properly. And since Andretti, 2 more kart champions have made the swap, Jacques Villeneuve and Juan Pablo Montoya. Well aware of the problems experienced by Michael, Frank gave JV all the testing he could possibly give him so he could get used to driving these different cars, by which point Formula 1 cars had lost all the driver aids and were a lot more conventional versus what was seen in 1993. Jacques even went as far as to bang the car on pole for his first race at Melbourne and almost won it, if not for an oil leak that left Damon absolutely caked in the stuff. Yes, he had a god-tier Adrian Newey Williams, but to come in and immediately upstage the team leader in Damon Hill, it made people take notice, especially given he'd won the IndyCar title and the Indy 500 the previous year. Maybe I need to do a retrospective video on JV. Villeneuve would be the champion at the end of 1997, but Montoya's career wasn't so fruitful. While he had those showings of absolutely insane speed, Montoya was in Formula 1 at the time of the Schumacher and Ferrari dominance years, and also didn't get along much with the politics of the sport. His cars were often unreliable too, and he also made people take notice when he used his rolling start experience to absolutely murk Schumacher at the Senna S in only his 3rd race. This was when they got going after a safety car period. Since then, the last US open wheel champion to come over was Sebastian Bourdais. But all of this is not to say that Andretti is totally done with Formula 1. He's trying very, very hard to get his own team onto the Formula 1 grid. So if there were accusations about him not being dedicated then, he certainly is now. So then, a look at the so-called disastrous season that Michael Andretti had in Formula 1 in 1993. If this has been interesting for you, teaching you new things that you didn't necessarily know about and clarifying some things you've heard about but weren't so sure, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed with the Stefan bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon for all the support, and if you want to help keep things running around here, then there is a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs that you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks if you just want to buy me a coffee, and also memberships for those that want to be a bit more overt with their support or otherwise use it as a Patreon alternative. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.